All right, welcome back. I would ask our esteemed panelists to please turn on their cameras so we can add you to the spotlight. It does not allow me to spotlight you if you don't turn on your camera, which seems demanding. So we had one of our participants comment in the chat that they're so excited for this intersectionality panel. And I absolutely agree. We are waiting for a third panelist. I did text her. We may get started without her in the interest of respecting everyone's time. So we have discussed intersectionality in a lot of our presentations. And intersectionality is often one of those topics that often gets lip service. We often say like, oh yes, and intersectionality and multiple identities for people. And it's not, I'm going to stop my share momentarily to try to do this a little bit better. And then we don't necessarily spend more time going into depth on what intersectionality can look like. So I am going to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to get into discussing just some ideas for, my goodness, I'm trying to make this screen sharing work as well as our introduction, and I am struggling with it, so I apologize. All right. All right, thank you all for your patience. Again, we are still waiting for our final panelist, and if that doesn't work out, then that's okay. This is a disability conference and we are flexible. So first, I am going to introduce Dr. Sandra Leon-Villa. Dr. Leon-Villa is the owner and operator of Innovation Behavioral Health Solutions, LLC, and it is their mission to create access to mental health care through equity, which means ensuring that everyone has equal access to well-being, regardless of socioeconomic status or other barriers. Dr. Leon-Villa strives to eliminate mental health stigma by decolonizing mental health, providing community outreach, psychoeducation, and ensuring diversity and inclusion not only in the community, but also in her team of clinical and administrative staff. And we are also honored to have Dr. Katie Wang. Dr. Wang is an assistant professor in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Yale School of Public Health. She received her PhD in social psychology from Yale University and completed a postdoctoral fellowship through the Yale AIDS Prevention Training Program. Dr. Wang's research broadly focuses on the role of stigma as a psychosocial determinant of mental and behavioral health disparities among diverse marginalized populations, and is also a very active member of DARN. And in the event that she is able to join us, I will provide an introduction for Dr. Bertranna Muruthi. Dr. Muruthi is an assistant professor in the Department of Community Health and Prevention at Drexel University. Dr. Muruthi uses an intersectionality lens within a transnational framework to explore how immigrant experiences evolve and change as immigrants stay connected to their native countries while in their host countries. And she utilizes this framework not only in her teaching and training of mental health professionals, but also in her own professional practice. So I sent out some questions, and of course, we encourage the panelists to discuss anything that they believe is relevant based on your broad experience in teaching, community outreach, professional practice. So to start with, I would like to ask you both to introduce yourself and discuss where you think we are in terms of understanding and respecting intersectionality, particularly in your specific field. So Dr. Leon-Villa, if you would start, please.
Thank you first of all, for the invitation today. I am so happy to be with you all discussing intersectionality. And just to introduce myself, I carry a lot of different hats, different roles, but I am a first-gen daughter of immigrants. I am Indigenous Mexican. I'm also autistic and ADHD. Like you mentioned, most of my work focused on liberatory models of psychology and really understanding the intersections of not only being Indigenous, a woman of color, but also being neurodivergent. And where I think we are in terms of the field, there's so much work. I saw on your page a post about disparities and disabilities. But when I think about disparities, I'm often thinking about communities of color and how intersectionality was really birthed as a result of women of color not being included in issues of feminism, for example. And so when I think about intersectionality and disability and all of these other identities that I also carry, I think we're only now recognizing the unique issues that people of color experience with regards to intersectionality and disability. And working from a decolonial perspective, I am understanding still, right? We're constantly learning and unlearning and really understanding what that means for me as a first-gen daughter of immigrants, what that means with regards to my own colonial and historical wounds on top of disparities that people with disabilities experience. And so while I think we're moving in the right direction, I think there's still so much work from the perspective of an autistic woman. Being unmasked is now transforming into a different lens through which I see unmasking that has so much to do with how people of color have been othered in this country, but also historically in countries that have been colonized. And so I do think we're moving in the right direction, but there's so much work to do, specifically within the intersections of people of color on top of other identities that contribute to our oppression.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, Dr. Wang, could you please introduce yourself and talk about where you think we are in terms of intersectionality, especially in your field?
Sure, thank you. So my name is Katie Wang. I am a faculty member here at the Yale School of Public Health in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences. I am a social health psychologist by training, so a lot of my research focuses on stigma and how it relates to health inequities. I am also an Asian American woman who is blind. I was born in Taiwan and I moved to the United States with my family when I was 13. So just basically thinking about intersectionality is very closely aligned with both of my professional and my personal interest. And I teach a course on stigma and health. And based on kind of my teaching and just doing research in this stigma and health equity space, I would say the field is definitely moving in the right direction. Concerning intersectionality, I think there's an increasing recognition that all of us belong in multiple social groups and no identity exists in a vacuum. However, I do think there is still a lot more work to be done when it comes to looking at the intersection between disability and other identities. So most of the literature that currently exists on intersectionality mostly focuses on the intersection among gender, race, and sometimes social class and sexual orientation are also mentioned. But there's very little work on intersectionality pertaining to disability. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the field of public health and medicine and psychology still adopts a mostly medical model towards disability. So there's not a lot of awareness of disability as a social identity. And I think in order for us to have a meaningful conversation about intersectionality when it comes to disabled individuals, we really need to start thinking more about disability as a form of human diversity, as a form of social identity, and then going from there, thinking about how disability intersects with other social identities. I think the field is only starting to move in the direction, but there's still a lot more work to be done.
Thank you. And that moves us quite nicely to my next question. As you both said that the field is still pretty early in its acknowledgement or their respective acknowledgements of intersectionality. So what are some of the most common misperceptions you encounter regarding intersectionality? So Dr. Wang, if you want to start this time.
Sure. So I think one common misperception is that people tend to see multiple sources of oppression as additive, right? So people tend to assume that when you have a disability and you are also a person of color, those you are going to encounter more stress compared to people with disabilities who are white or people of color who don't have disabilities. And that is to some extent true, but that is also oversimplistic. So the different identities we have tend to interact in a number of different ways. It's not just additive. It can also be multiplicative, right? So it's what we often say in the field of intersectionality is that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So as an immigrant and a woman with a disability, my experiences are unique. It's different from a man with a disability who is not an immigrant or a man who has a disability and also an immigrant. It's hard to like tease apart those experiences separately. And one thing I have learned in my own research journey into intersectionality is that qualitative research methods are often better suited in understanding the complex and multifaceted experiences of intersectionality compared to traditional quantitative methods such as multiple regression. Another thing I would say is that there needs to be, so another common misperception is that there is little recognition of the resilience that is possessed by people with intersecting identities. So as a person with a disability who is an immigrant, I have connections with other immigrants with disabilities. And that community offers me additional sense of solidarity. It provides me with another source of resilience I can potentially tap into when navigating different forms of stigma and different forms of inequities in my life. And I think that sort of resilience that can be derived from relating to other people who share similar identities is not very well recognized in discussions and discourse about intersectionality.
Yeah, that's so important. Dr. Leon-Villa, what do you think?
Well, I have a little bit of a different perspective, and I think it has to do a lot more with my disabilities being not obvious physically, right? I have an invisible disability when we talk about being neurodivergent. And when I think about the misperceptions that come along with that, especially as a high masking, late diagnosed autistic woman, is that a lot of the misperceptions have to do with the stigmatized ideas and stereotypes that we've developed about conditions like autism. And a lot of that does come from a medical model perspective, which is different for someone who experiences a physical disability, right? And as a person of color at the intersections of being autistic and first gen, and when I think about the disparities that we already experience within mental health, for example, as a psychologist, my work involves working with the BIPOC community, doing neuropsychological assessments, right, for autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions. And so the disparities that are already in place for folks in general within the psychological field have a negative impact against populations of color. right? So when we add an additional factor of an invisible disability, then now we have even less access to services. We know that children of color are less likely to be diagnosed with autism. It takes them a lot more visits to be diagnosed. And it also requires them a whole lot more to have even accommodations within the school system. So the disparities that are already in place are a compounding factor. So on top of being a person of color who is more likely to be misdiagnosed or missed, we already have less access to services, and our invisible disabilities are more likely to be confused with a behavior or a conduct problem. And so when I think about that, there's definitely a lot of misperceptions or misdiagnosis and misinformation that is happening within the field when it comes to being autistic, a person of color, maybe even an immigrant, right? So we're adding multiple identities that already are oppressed on top of other disparities that already exist. And so for me, a lot of the misperceptions are coming from these stigmatized ideas of what autism should look like, what impairment in functioning should look like. And some of the things that I hear often, especially from other clinicians who maybe work in assessment or work with neurodevelopmental conditions, are just these misinformation that is being perpetuated in the field in a way. One woman reached out to me via a message and said, I got my assessment done and my clinician said, you're too empathetic to be autistic. You carry a conversation too well to be autistic. And for me, that is such a red flag because we internalize so much of the dysregulation that happens as high masking women. We internalize a lot of what we typically see in children as externalizing behavior, specifically boys, for example. Women are internalizing that, and it's coming out as anxiety, it's coming out as depression, it's coming out as interpersonal problems. And so these misperceptions are absolutely adding another barrier of challenges for people of color. And so that's kind of where I'm at in terms of how these misperceptions have affected me, and in terms of all the identities that I wear, but also with the communities that I work with. So I didn't mention it when you first asked, but I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I practice neuropsychological assessment and work, but I also own a group practice where we focus on community mental health, but also bringing in more holistic approaches that allow us to practice outside of the medical model, which deems me as having something that's wrong with me, right? As opposed to, this is how my brain works, or this is how I socialize, this is how I interact with people. But we keep getting these messages of there's something wrong with me, the individual.
Yes, thank you. And welcome, Dr. Muruthi. We're so excited to have you here. We just finished the first couple questions. So if you don't mind, could you please introduce yourself and tell us where you think we are in terms of intersectionality, especially in your field? And then to add multiple questions, what do you think some of the most common misperceptions are about intersectionality, particularly in your field?
Hello, everyone. I apologize for being late. I have toddlers. That's the only excuse I have. My name is Bertranna Muruthi. I'm a professor at Drexel University here in Philadelphia. My research looks mostly at immigrant families, resiliency, and intersectionality. And an array of other things that I do within the communities here in Philly. I'm trying to see your question. So the first question was, how does intersectionality, how is it placed within my field? I do believe, I'm a marriage and family therapist also. I do believe that within my field, they don't really understand how to apply intersectionality within the room, with clients, with families, in the community. I think a lot of times we talk about it as this abstract kind of thing. And so I personally try to bring it into the classroom and to show my students that it's not just a theory, abstract, living in your textbook, that we need to also bring it in, think about it, and not only for the client, but also how it impacts them as clinicians and how they see the client, if that makes any sense. And the other question was sort of
the biggest misperceptions in your field about intersectionality.
I think we're still stuck on gender, race, class. And we don't want to look outside of that or within that, what it means. And so I think we're still kind of just in this old school mind of it. Also, I know that there is a lot of sort of tussle in literature around, Black feminist theory and sort of the roots of intersectionality and sort of how it comes about, and can you apply that outside of marginalized communities of color? Can it be applied that way, right? So I've heard those arguments too. So I think there's always tussle in the literature, as I call it, around intersectionality and how it's perceived in our field.
Excellent, thank you. So for our next question, and Dr. Leon-Villa, I'd like to start with you for this because you alluded to it. What are the consequences that you've witnessed of lack of respect and understanding for intersectional identities and experiences?
Yeah, so I immediately think about the medical model, right? And how hard it is even for parents to receive an autism diagnosis, for example, right? And so much of that has to do with this idea of having been othered. And I definitely want to go more into this with your next question, but seeing things from a historical perspective and how much that has fed into the negative stereotypes that we see on things like ADHD or autism within our communities have had such a negative impact in communities of color specifically, to the point that sometimes we are so much more concerned about something being wrong with our children than with getting what needs to be done to get them accommodations, to get them help, right? And so much of that has to do with how we perceive anything that's outside of neurotypicality, anything that's outside of Eurocentric ideas of intellect, beauty, right? All of these things that we've been really programmed to think is the only acceptable way of functioning or socializing or being and moving in this world, right? And so we really need to move from seeing autism and other invisible disabilities as something being inherently wrong with people versus let's accommodate how other people socialize. Let's accommodate differences in sensory processing or differences in social communication. So we're so quick to deem something as wrong or incorrect. There's only one way of doing things, that we're unwilling to really accommodate people and allow them to be themselves, right? So we spend so much time hiding on top of these other identities that have been othered. And that for me is where intersection really meets as an Indigenous woman of color, that not only are these identities that I carry also oppressed, but so is how my brain works, right? So is how I function and how I move about in this world. And so shedding light on that, I think, is really important, because we need to reframe when we are, giving people diagnoses, for example, giving people this feedback when I'm doing an assessment, and helping parents move away from just feeling that grief of, oh, there is something wrong, because the challenges that people with invisible disabilities and those with visible disabilities experience are really a result of other people not being willing to accommodate us.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Wang, what about you? What are the consequences that you see in your field and in your experience for lack of understanding of intersectionality?
Well, I think one consequence is that the experience of multiply marginalized populations are often overlooked. So I remember reading a research article looking at the experiences of domestic violence survivors who are disabled women of color. And one issue they kept running into is that these participants had a lot of difficulty getting services when they were trying to leave an abusive relationship, because they were not, when they tried to seek out services from disability organizations, they are they are not necessarily culturally competent. They may not speak the language that a participant speaks. They may not have connections to translation services. But when they try to go to the organizations that serve their culture groups, say like a group that serves Asian Americans or Chinese Americans or Mexican Americans, they run into disability related barriers, right? These organizations are not equipped to provide reasonable accommodations. They don't know what to do when a disabled client comes seeking services. So these women encounter double bind in terms of leaving a very difficult situation, is that they are encountering racism in one space and they are encountering ableism in another space. And that leads also into the second consequence I want to talk about is the disability oftentimes overshadows the rest of our identities. So especially for those of us with visible disabilities, when people see us as disabled, they kind of gravitate towards that and they forget that the rest of our identity still exists and the rest of identity still shape our experiences. So anecdotally, just from speaking to some of my friends and people I know who are LGBTQ plus and disabled, they have a lot of difficulty finding community in LGBTQ plus spaces because people would notice that they are blind or they use a wheelchair or they are deaf, and they kind of just let that those communication challenges or their mobility challenges get in the way, and they don't see them as a fellow LGBTQ plus person. So I think that kind of overshadowing in terms of disability taking over our entire identities can have very problematic consequences in terms of helping us find community.
Yeah, those are such good points. And your discussion of domestic violence survivors made me think of the quote from Ducille several years ago that one of the dangers of standing in an intersection is the increased likelihood of being run over. So, yeah.
It's a great quote.
It's just making sure I cite that. I'll try to find the actual link. Dr. Muruthi, what about you? What do you see in your field are the consequences of ignorance of intersectionality?
Thank you so much, Dr. Wang. Is that appropriate? Wang?
And Dr. Wang.
Wang, thank you so much for even mentioning this idea of how, intersectionality sometimes creates this barrier where you may not get what you need depending on where you go because of who you are. I do a lot of community work. I've done stuff in DC, in Philly, and in Oregon. And one of the things that I have seen is that oftentimes people are kind of lost in the system because they are within a group that's not recognized. So for an example, looking at Black immigrants who oftentimes live near African Americans and kind of get, they don't really get seen within the community as having a need. And so I just kind of thought about that as you were talking about this idea of intersections often creating somewhat of a barrier for people to get what they need. But kind of going back to your question, Carolyn, I do believe that oftentimes in my field in particular, there's like this myth of resources or myth of access. And it's quite frustrating. A lot of agencies are overburdened, don't have the resources that they need, and yet they still keep sort of getting people, right? And so I am mostly, I'm in academia, but I'm very much also in community, but not everybody who's in academia is also in community. And so there's like a disconnect, right, of like what's actually happening in community. And so when we're teaching our students, when we're giving them, things to think about, oftentimes we're given myths or they're given ideals or they're given like, here's what is supposed to happen and here's the process. And then when they actually go into the real working field, working with different populations, they realize that that's just not the case. And I hate to be like a Debbie Downer, by the way, but it's just the truth, right? And so this idea of like, how do we sort of connect these, like, as I said before, these like theoretical ideas around intersectionality, and also how do they play out in the field, and how do we show our students how to play them out in the field? And so I just really want to, for me, I try to give them reality so that they're not blindsided. And oftentimes when students are blindsided, sometimes they cause harm, right? To communities that they're trying to help and not harm. And so I think that's a huge sort of, and I can call it like sort of like downfall of the ways that we present intersectionality to people who are actually working for those in the field. Am I answering your question properly?
You are, and you are brilliantly segueing into our next question. You all have done a fantastic job of setting up my next questions. I love it. So, when teaching about intersectionality, and this could be to students, to mentees, to colleagues, what do you think are some of the most important things that you want learners to understand? So, Dr. Muruthi, we'll start with you, please.
Of course. And actually, this is great because it helps me. I'm thinking of a student who taught me a huge lesson about 2 years ago. The student identified as queer, also had disabilities, and also presented as white. And we were in class and they said, when do I stop learning about them? So sorry, when do I start learning about me? And when do I learn about them, right? This is a student. And that quote really stuck with me because I realized that oftentimes we're teaching about, you know, how to work with Black people, how to work with these people, how to work with those people, right? And to me, he said, how do I work with them? How do I sit in a room with them? And, you know, they have these perceptions of me or see me in a certain way, right? And so from that point on, I began to teach that way, right? I taught how to work with white clients. I taught how to work with able clients. I taught, you know, how to work with non-queer clients and how do you sit in the room when you are the person who holds, you know, the marginality, right? And sometimes my students who were white would be taken aback by that lesson plan, right? Because it may just be maybe one Black person in the class, and all of a sudden I'm teaching how to work with white people. But I think that it's only fair that you are able to feel the same things that maybe your colleague may be feeling every single day in every single class, right? And so that's kind of my way, one of my ways that I really try to let my students know that as a clinician, you're not just looking to solve intersectionality or go out there and do the intersectionality, but how do you look at yourself and how you are placed within it, right? And how you impact it positively and negatively, you know, intentionally and unintentionally, right? Even myself constantly making mistakes, right? And how do you repair when you do rupture intentionally and unintentionally? And so that's sort of the ways that I'm trying to address it, but as well as I grow because my students constantly teach me and I hold what they say as valuable. And that one student changed the way I taught forever, right? And so that's sort of one way that I approach that. Thank you.
That's excellent. Dr. Wang, what about you? When you teach students or teach anyone, what are some of the things you think are important for them to learn?
So there are two things I do when I teach about intersectionalities. As I said earlier, I teach a course on stigma and health. And we do have a module that's specifically dedicated to intersectionality. But in addition to that, I also try to incorporate intersectionality throughout the entire semester. So I want students to know that when we talk about any stigmatized identity, we are talking about it in the context of an intersection. No identity exists in a vacuum. So when I talk about structural stigma, I try to bring in research on multiply marginalized population and talk about how structural stigma impacts them. When I talk about social and behavioral consequences of stigma, I try to bring in literature looking at how multiply marginalized population cope with different forms of stigma, instead of just focusing on how Black people cope with racism or how LGBTQ people cope with homophobia. So that's one thing I try to do is to kind of infuse intersectionality throughout the entire curriculum. Another thing I do is to focus on disability as a form of human diversity. So as I said earlier, I think the medical model of disability has really hindered attempt to incorporate disability into a larger conversation about intersectionality. So I talk about ableism a lot in my course. I talk a lot about the different research that has been done on disability identity. I talk about disability justice as a way to, as a means of social change and as a way to reduce disability stigma. So I talk a lot about that research with the goal of helping students come to see disability as a social identity. And hopefully building on that, students can be in a better position to think about disability as part of intersectionality.
That's brilliant. Thank you. What about you, Dr. Leon-Villa? What are the things that you think are important to communicate to your students, colleagues, mentees?
Yes, so I do teach mostly via workshops, but I'm also a training site here in Nevada for doctoral students. And one of the things that I really focus on is really a few things. So within neurodiversity and at the intersections of neurodiversity, for me, it's important to recognize and teach them that neurodiversity or neurodivergence can be a result of multiple things, not just ADHD and autism, for example. I see myself as neurodivergent for multiple reasons because I'm a complex trauma survivor. I'm also, I have anxiety, but also because I'm autistic and ADHD, right? So teaching that neurodiversity can look and encompasses a lot of different things, but also meets at the intersections of these identities. In addition to that, I like to talk about the female phenotype of autism, because it moves away from these stereotypical perspectives of autism, largely based on research that has been predominantly focused on white boys, right? And so one of the thoughts that came up when I was listening to some of the other panelists is, yes, we want to learn how to work with everyone while at the same time engaging in critical consciousness about how most research is based on white people. We have the blueprint, we have the framework of how mental health and other issues show up in white populations, because historically, we've been left out of research. And when we have been included in research, and I'm talking about people of color, people with disabilities, right? The multiple intersections, when we have been included, it's also from a Eurocentric lens, right? Who are the researchers? What are the questions, right? What are the methods of the research? And so we need to recognize part of my teaching involves this critical consciousness. Let's increase your consciousness so that we can approach and question things with a critical mindset. And so for me, I go back to the reasons that, for example, autistic, high masking people, why we mask, right? And we're really masking, again, as I mentioned earlier, because we've been othered. And a lot of the issues that affect BIPOC communities specifically, when we go to the root of the issue, we can trace it back all the way to colonial wounds. We can go all the way back. And so when we are learning as people of color, as Indigenous people, as Black and Brown people or neurodivergent folks, why we mask, why we keep from being our full authentic selves, then we also have to question why we learned, who taught us that we were othered, who taught us that we couldn't show up the way that we want to show up, who taught us that it's not okay to rock back and forth, to stim in public, who taught us this was inappropriate behavior, right? And when we trace that back and look at it with a critical eye, then we can really understand the historical context that has really had an impact on communities of color who also experience disabilities. And so I really focus on moving away from the medical model, taking a strengths-based approach. I don't talk about social communication deficits. I talk about social communication differences. I don't talk about sensory processing disorders. I talk about sensory processing differences, right? And so how are these things impacting us? And when we can understand that we've been teaching autistic people to mask and it's causing us trauma, anxiety, and depression, then maybe we can learn to accommodate so that we can be more accepting of differences rather than looking at people as deficits or deficient.
Yes, I love that. And that makes me think of one of the maybe most common questions in disability advocacy, specifically regarding education, which is, what is so special about my needs? Why are my needs special and everybody else's needs are unspecial? Like, where did those ideas come from? So before we get to the final question that I sent you, I want to make sure we have time to properly discuss some of the questions in the chat, if that's okay with everyone, because this first one is, I think, a fabulous question for critical thinking, and that is, how can intersectionality redefine ableism?
Any of us?
And anyone who has thoughts is welcome to start.
Well, I think ableism is rooted in what is considered acceptable, right? What has been deemed acceptable, and then who are the people who deemed it acceptable? What do they look like, right? And so ableism is really based on this idea that people should behave, live, speak, act a certain way, right? And when people fail to meet those expectations, then we deem them as deficient, as I just mentioned. And so it really goes hand in hand, right? Once we can really disrupt that programming, those ideas that have taught us that people should behave and be a certain way, that people should move around the world, walk about this world in a certain way, then we can also move away from seeing them as having shortcomings.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Wang, Dr. Muruthi, anything to add to how intersectionality can redefine ableism?
I was formulating my thoughts. I don't want them to come out like badly, but I guess I could share the preliminaries of my thoughts. And what came to mind was like responsibility. And I feel like intersectionality is trying to, or is should be putting the responsibility of these things in the hands of people who violate, right? I think that those of us who are being criticized or critiqued for who we are, I think that we are the ones who are constantly sort of thinking and wondering and, you know, trying to theorize, and which I think is good and we should. As well as I feel like there's like a responsibility too for the dominant society to also look at their behaviors and their ways of doing things. And I know that's kind of idealistic of me to say. That's why I was kind of sitting with it like, because I always hate the fact that when I'm in spaces like this, that I see people who think like me and who, you know, we're all kind of on the same page, and those who should be in the room are never in the room. And so I feel like intersectionality in a lot of ways, and I even think, you know, Kimberly Crenshaw, thank you for sharing this definition here. But I think, you know, there is this idea of like, why is it always our burden or our responsibility or our, you know, this thing of change, right? And it always is, and I guess it always will be maybe, but that there needs to be responsibility if and when it ever comes, right? That's what it's coming. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of what I was percolating on over here.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Wang, what do you think? How intersectionality can redefine ableism?
So I would like to build on the responsibility piece. I think right now ableism is still considered very much a niche area in research. Only a very small minority of researchers are working on issues related to ableism, which is unfortunate because many of these researchers happen also to be disabled. So I think there's the disproportionate burden placed on people with disabilities. You know, if we want to study ableism, if we want to improve the lives of people with disabilities, disabled individuals are kind of tasked with that work. And I think we would definitely be a lot more effective. We would have more allies, and we would also be able to accomplish more. So I hope that a conversation about intersectionality can shed a light on ableism and to bring in other people who are interested in stigma, prejudice, and discrimination more generally to also think about the impact of ableism on their work, right? So like racism, for example, is a very well-established area of inquiry in the field of stigma. So if we start thinking about how ableism might intersect with racism to shape the lives and experiences of people of color with disabilities, then hopefully that conversation will spark the interest of some of the racism scholars, and they will also start working on issues related to disability as well. And I think the same can apply to other forms of stigma. So it might also be a little bit idealistic of me, but what I'm hoping is that intersectionality can shed a light on ableism so that more people can become interested in the topic and the more work can be done on this area.
Yes. And going along with that, we have a very specific question that Dr. Wang, you discussed research multiple times. So we have a participant that wants to know what would be the better option for research methods for the topic of Puerto Ricans with disabilities? What do you think that would be, qualitative or mixed method?
Mm-hmm.
So Puerto Ricans with disabilities is a very, specific population, obviously. I don't really have any expertise in that area, but I would say just in general, when you think about doing any type of research on intersectional populations, I think finding a way to incorporate some kind of qualitative methods would be ideal, because as I said earlier, when you're only using quantitative methods, what you often end up with is an additive approach. So you're measuring racism, you're measuring ableism, and you are thinking about how those two things add together, but you are not really measuring the specific barriers, challenges, and maybe even sources of resilience that this multiple marginalized population might be encountering. So, it obviously depends on your specific research question. I think qualitative methods would be great. If you also have specific construct you would like to assess with questionnaires, then I think mixed methods will be ideal as well. But I do think some kind of qualitative inquiry in there will be very helpful.
Yes, thank you. Apologies if it seems like I'm rushing you all. I want to make sure we get to the questions that have been in the chat. Dr. Leon-Villa, this one is specifically for you. Hello, I am an undergraduate psychology student, also a BIPOC autistic woman. I want to be a clinical psychologist, and my dream is to work with BIPOC, neurodivergent, or neurodiverse children and teens in urban areas, especially where I grew up in New York City. So, Dr. Leon-Villa, do you have any advice for going through higher education as an autistic woman? Was there anything that grounded you in your studies amidst potential anxiety, sensory overload, experiencing ableism, etc.?
So I wasn't diagnosed as autistic until after my graduate program. And a lot of that came from my work in neuropsychology with neurodevelopmental assessments. But I think in general, going through academia can be a really difficult process as a person of color in general. Back when I was in graduate school, I was the only Latina on my cohort, and there weren't very many other people who looked like me, including my professors. So I would just say, I'm hoping that things are a lot different now, and there's more BIPOC focused programs where you can get a lot more information that's liberation psychology focused. And I say liberation psychology because liberation psychology is really focused on giving voice to the oppressed. And so finding community, whether it's in your school or outside your school, now there is so many more like support, even pages on Instagram, like grad life, grad student, pages that help you find support, but also finding mentors. I have never met another psychologist, woman of color, who's also autistic. And so I think it's important to find your people, because we do heal in community, and so we find support in community. And so I would just say that find what you need, seek accommodations. I could have used accommodations, but I was that high masking person who fell through the gaps and didn't get any support. So find accommodations, visit your school's, resource center or learning center and seek out, support, seek out an assessment, seek out things that are going to help you be successful and minimize the stress that not only being neurodivergent, but being a person of color in academia can bring, because it can be pretty traumatizing. And if I can, I just wanted to quickly add about the research question that from a liberation psychology perspective, we want to include community. We want to include participatory action research, which again gives voices to the people you are assessing, but also helps you guide the questions. I think it's important that researchers are also including other folks that are conducting the research that look like the people you are assessing, that are able to communicate with them, because otherwise you can have a study full of Puerto Rican folks with a white researcher who's still bringing in a Eurocentric perspective. And so you want to bring in the perspective of the people. And we don't want to place the onus of responsibility of folks, just like we don't expect brown folks to be the only, or Black and brown folks to be the only ones decolonizing. I think allies are so important as well, right? So that's not our responsibility, just like it's not our responsibility to disrupt ableism alone.
Yeah, absolutely. We have one more question in the chat here before I think our final question. I'd love to hear your thoughts on applying an intersectional framework to the issue of applied behavioral analysis. I am against ABA as it encourages masking, but I've heard a critique that this perspective reflects white privilege. For example, that unmasking comes with a higher cost for BIPOC autistics.
So in the consensus in the autistic community is that ABA is harmful. Now, when I talk about neurodiversity, when I give neurodiversity affirming workshops, I talk about the origins of ABA. I talk about, the father of ABA, which is Lovas. I talk about the problematic origins of that, including things like conversion therapy, right? I talk about Asperger's and his affiliation with the Nazi Party and how that is also contributing to how people are othered. So when we think about this birthing of autistics being othered and ABA being deemed this gold standard of services for autistics, then we should also question what the goal of ABA is. And if of adults who received ABA as children are saying, this caused me depression, it caused me anxiety, it caused me PTSD, then we need to listen, because again, the researchers who are doing the research on ABA or autism are not autistics, right? These are neurotypicals. And largely the information we have about ABA is based on parents who just want their kids to be quote unquote normal, right? So again, who othered us? Where does this come from? And how can we find liberation in being able to show up fully authentically? Because now I understand who made me feel othered in the first place.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. And then for the last question, before we go on another brief break before our final event, what are some of your favorite resources? So books, shows, social media accounts, etc., on intersectionality and disability. So Dr. Wang, let's start with you.
So I would really strongly recommend Alice Wang. So her last name is spelled W-O-N-G. She is an Asian American disability activist who lives in the Bay Area. She did this really impressive initiative called the Disability Visibility Project, which she interviewed a number of people with disabilities from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. They talk a lot about intersectionality in those interviews. So what she was trying to do basically is to kind of shed light on disability justice and intersectionality through storytelling. She also wrote a book called Year of the Tiger, which I really enjoy. It's a collection of essays she has written over the years, as well as some autobiographical pieces about growing up in the United States as a daughter of immigrants, as Asian American who have a disability. So I would just really recommend you checking out her work. I believe that on her website, you can also find a presentation she gave a couple of years ago on the experiences of Asian Americans with disabilities in particular. So yes, that will be my recommendation.
Thank you. Dr. Muruthi, what about you?
Everyone's probably going to hate this, but TikTok has been really helpful for me because there's often people that you can follow who, identify certain ways and are actually speaking for communities and speaking about needs and being pretty authentic. I think it's become a very big platform for folks, but I think you have to also be careful because oftentimes when you follow things like that, you also get the flip side of people who are total idiots, I'm gonna say it, right? Or just mean or, whatever. But I would say TikTok has been helpful for me, one, to keep up with the young ones, because I think, they're going through different things. And I think oftentimes when you're in academia specifically, I always say this, you get lost in the sauce, and I'm very much community. I'm very much like, you know, just trying to stay leveled and grounded and to be with the people. And right now the people are with TikTok. So that's what I do to kind of do that. So thank you.
Yes, excellent. All right, Dr. Leon-Villa, take us home.
I agree with that. I found, and I'm going to plug myself, I'm on TikTok and I'm on there talking about autism and social justice, which are my, restricted interests, my special interests. And every now and then I share some of my art. But I really went on TikTok because there was nobody that represented people who look like me, who are high masking and are also in the field. But there's other clinicians who are also on like Instagram and doing things on other platforms like TikTok. One of them is Izzy and ADHD. She is a Latina woman who talks about what it means and what it looks like to be neurodivergent and really just destigmatizing, different ways of functioning in the world. There's also, I had Atine, which is AUTIE.NA, but also neurodivergent Lou. There's Mrs. Speechy, who talks a lot about the female. She's a speech pathologist who talks about the female phenotype and what that looks like in girls, because really the goal is to minimize missed diagnosis, but also misdiagnosis, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you all so much. I know a lot of people were looking forward to this panel, and I know I was really excited to have such a breadth of experience and expertise, and you have surpassed my expectations, and that's just speaking for me. So thank you all so much. We are going to take one more 5-minute break before our final Q&A panel. So take a break and we will see you all soon.